Hi, my name is Michaela Malson, and I'm here to introduce a demonstration debate from the 2020 Georgetown Debate Seminar. On the affirmative, the first speaker will be Kathy Martinez, a rising sophomore at Georgetown University and debater. She formerly debated at Northside in Chicago, and she is a fan favorite. The second affirmative speaker will be Darcell Brown. Darcell is the head debate coach at the University High School Academy in Michigan and a debater at Wayne State University. He's also a longtime beloved instructor at the Georgetown Debate Seminar. On the negative, the first speaker will be Zidao Wang, who just graduated from Homestead High School, where he had a very successful high school debate career. He will be a first-year debater for Georgetown this fall. And the second negative speaker will be Anthony Trufanov, winner of the 2019 National Debate Tournament and coach at the University of Kentucky and Glenbrook North High School. The affirmative that you'll hear today will propose that the United States federal government should require that risk assessments be used in the sentencing process in the American criminal justice system. That risk assessments used in the sentencing process in the American criminal justice system should implement algorithmic affirmative action in order to correct for racial bias in those risk assessments. And this affirmative has two advantages. They argue first that altering risk assessment algorithms in this way is an important mechanism to reduce discrimination against people of color in our sentencing system. And second, they argue that this affirmative enables effective engineering of artificial intelligence more broadly to combat global inequalities. The negative will present a variety of off-case positions in the 1 and C, including the state's counterplan with the federalism net benefit, an elections DA about the presidential election, an abolitionism critique, and a topicality argument that Enact requires legislative action. And the debate proceeds from there. Without further ado, we'll shift over to the 1AC from Kathy Martinez.
First is inherency. Use of race as an explicit input in risk assessments at sentencing will inevitably be struck down by the court, but the shift to using proxy inputs is even worse. The Equal Protection Clause lacks teeth for dealing with the proxy discrimination because it focused on facial neutrality. That's Yang. In 19, we see the mainstream view rejecting the use of protected characteristics and algorithms with consensus on impermissibility of race. If race was included, the use of sentencing would constitute an equal protection violation. Viewed as highly likely, courts consider this issue may reject the use of race and risk assessment instruments. The seemingly fair algorithmic inputs for proxy protected characteristics such as race, the use of these harming individuals in protected class. There is no precedent regarding proxies. The inputs correlated with race will exacerbate unacceptable racial disparities. For example, prior arrests may not reflect criminal behavior, but bias in policing such that can result in past discrimination being baked in, while using factors that correlate with race may be troubling. Existing doctrine does not suggest that the inclusion in risk assessment would constitute an equal protection violation. The dividing line between which proxies are problematic and which are not is ill-defined. The criminal history is highly correlated with race is universally embraced in risk assessment instruments. Deciding which proxies are permissible is ad hoc, and fixing that requires revamping the Equal Protection Clause to allow the active use of race to reduce discrimination outcomes. It's Yang in 19. The distinction of our solution in both proposals require the consideration of race to achieve a race-neutral prediction. The excluding inputs algorithm prohibits the use of race and correlates. Their approaches should not be subject to strict scrutiny, given that the use of race is not to treat individuals differently, but the opposite. The view or proposed solutions inconsistent with anti-subordination principle. This holds the evil of discrimination is not used and does not lie in the use of racial criterion for distinguishing people. The evil is a harm or inflicts on the disadvantage. Our statistical proposals rely on race for a non-subordinating use, and the plan both allows and requires the algorithms explicitly include race as a variable in order to actively correct for racial bias and outputs. The court's current anti-classification approach to equal protection would hold that unconstitutional. That's Yang in 19. Restricting is not likely to be effective in preventing classification bias. Other seemingly neutral factors closely correlate with protected characteristics. Rather than forbidding use of protected characteristics in their correlates, our solutions will retain predictive power, eliminating proxy effects. The formalistic position of excluding race from predictive algorithms may undermine the goals. Equal protection. Our proposed algorithms consistent with the EP. They require that the individuals are not treated differently on the basis of membership in protected class. And empirical tests, our algorithms substantially reduce the number of Black defendants detained. And that revised algorithmic approach is both necessary and solves, but any effort to mandate it now would get struck down by the court because it expressly considers race. That's Prince at 20. The first step is a statistical model to include data on legally prohibited characteristics. This removes predictive power that derives from permitted variables, the capacity of proxy for prohibited characteristics, nor is it entirely clear to be legally permissible. If this were legally mandated, one could imagine a constitutional challenge. Thus the plan. The United States federal government should require that risk assessments used at the sentencing employ algorithmic affirmative action to correct for any isolatable racial bias in algorithmic outputs, because doing so is required by the Equal Protection Clause. Advantage 1 is sentencing. Claims that actual risk assessments improve sentencing are wrong at present. Multiple fatal methodological flaws in every study to the contrary. That Starr and 15. The literature does not provide good empirical evidence that risk scores have predictive power. The instruments substantially outperform the informal instruments to defend its crime that judges perform the absent actual instruments. A few relevant studies who differ in conclusion. Serious flaws. Administrative office studies circularly define office prediction is accurate and consistent with the risk assessment instrument. When advocates claim that actual prediction outperforms humans, predictions used do not cite recidivism studies at all. There's a lot of variability in results, and that constitutes express statement of endorsement of racial discrimination that worsens intersectional disparities in the criminal justice system. That's Starr and 15. Advocates refer to evidence-based sentencing, although the risk score is unaffected by evidence. A more descriptive phrase is profiling, endorsing sentencing discriminations, embracing a system bound to worsen racial, class, and gender disparities. Related factors, instruments are considered race correlated, telling judges descendants on such factors, endorsing strategy to consider certain groups of people dangerous because of who they are. And use of race is a risk factor in criminal profiles, and is the linchpin of anti-Black annihilation. The court must sweepingly invalidate on equal protection grounds. Distinguishing sentencing would carve a loophole in the amendment based on compelling state interest, which empirically gets weaponized and guts a doctrine. That's Johnson 95. The nation's most effective means of achieving blackmail annihilation occurs through a criminal justice system. Emphasis on discriminatory impact of current criminal profiles on blackmails. The current militaristic approach fosters violence. Aggressive police tactics. Federal courts have upheld these sentencing distinctions against equal protection challenges. The federal laws distinguishing should be abolished. The current jurisprudence has created several exceptions based on balancing individual interests against state interests and effective law enforcement. In doing so, the court has opened the door to discriminatory police context as little redress for the victims. The acceptance and use of doctrines proved a devastating minority community. The doctrine may impose upon blackmail's constitutional rights. The population restrained from moving freely. The doctrine can be psychologically debilitating. And racism must be categorically rejected. That's Mammy in 2000. The struggle against racism will be long without remission. To accept the racist universe ignores fear, justice, and violence. One cannot find more order on racism because racism signifies exclusion and subjection to violence, and the refusal of racism the condition for morality. Advantage 2 is proxy discrimination. Algorithmic bias risks massive inequality, suffering, and extinction, but if steered correctly, could do the opposite. That's Thomas in 20, working to eliminate data bias, which is corrupting effect in algorithms. Currently a fat fly in the AI ointment. If we bumble into it, will be the biggest mistake in human history. It could be enable unprecedented inequality, suffering, and even human extinction. And specifically, AI must be engineered to actively counter disparities, or bias will be permanently baked in. That would lock in a new era of extreme inequality and massive civil unrest. At the same time, we face existential challenges, as Johnson in 20. The world has proven itself unforgiving. The famine, plague, subjugation, climate disaster, much more. Another threat is on the forefront. AI. There's a prosecution of AI drives inequality, divides communities, and denies human rights. AI creates a new form of inequality more impossible to dismantle. It can be engraved without properly vetting. Dismantling the bias could become daunting. Civil unrest would ensue. And algorithmic white supremacy is an existential threat to life, the U.S., and the world. It's Garrison in 19. Hatred didn't appear overnight, and heritage rooted in slavery and the continued struggle of the Black community for equal treatment, extremism, racist policies, and white supremacy stand existential threats. The use of algorithms as a proxy for immutable traits otherwise protected by law would result in negative impact. We will continue to face a nation-ending threat of white supremacy unless we invest in combating. And inequality risks rapid societal collapse and extinction must avert it by reducing societal stress. That's Camp 19. Collapse can be defined as rapid and enduring loss of population and identity complexity. Public services crumble, disorder ensues, inequality and central drives social disintegration and centralization of power. This handicaps society's ability to respond to ecological, social, and economic problems. The social societal resilience can be able to prevent collapse. More skilled populations have a greater capacity to respond. New technologies can mitigate against pressures. The world is worsening. Areas have contributed to collapse of previous societies. Any collapse risk being permanent. Nuclear war could result in extinction of our species. Technological abilities present unprecedented threats. And independently, proxy discrimination by AAs will carve a massive loophole into all anti-discrimination law. That's Prince in 20. GNI bars health insurance from discriminating. The genetic risk has results, yet certain types of results are directly predicted. Non-health insurance are regulated by the states. Historically, insurers discriminate because they're at greater risk. Employment anti-discrimination laws are a regime that prohibits directly predictive characteristics. The ADA prohibits discrimination against individuals with disability. AMI proxy discrimination, producing higher advancement recommendations. When a discriminator relies on indirectly predictive characteristics, it uses group characteristics of discriminator engagements in stereotyping. Objection have limited force. Proxy discrimination produce the results anti-discrimination laws are designed to prevent. And reducing discrimination is an absolute prerequisite to growth. Accounts for 40% of GDP growth over the past 50 years, and there's further left to go. That's Rubens in 19. Workplace discrimination continues to inflict economic costs. Study after study concludes reducing workplace discrimination accounted for 40% of increased economic output in the United States over the last half century. And that's key to U.S. economic survival and global competitiveness. Minority business boom is key. That's Bradley. And 16, the presence minority business, no small data point. The business owners have created more jobs in ruralized distressed communities. They need to dramatically increase investment in minority entrepreneurs is vital to survival of the U.S. economy. Lack of access to capital trickles down to bank loans and lines of credit strategies should be advanced in order to save the economy as business investments support America as an economic leader and driver in a global economy. And additionally, AI will either be the watershed for minority access to credit or the end of it. That's Klein in 19. In the age of AI technologies, the potential to transform credit allocation. There's a history of credit being used for discrimination. The loans are uniquely powerful. Credit can provide new opportunities to increase capital. Efforts must be made to ensure that credit is not allocated in a discriminatory fashion. In the real world, factors used to determine are almost always correlated in societal level with protected class. How will AI challenge the equation? AI's destruction in a manner that makes proxy discrimination likely. Policymakers need to rethink our anti-discriminatory framework. And economic collapse causes war, terrorism, mass inequality. Empirics prove it's highly likely. That's Liu in 18. Periods of economic distress have characterized public antipathy towards minority groups. Attitudes that can help fuel unrest, terrorism, or even war. High levels of inequality can play a significant role in stoking conflict. The correlation shall not be taken lightly.
Hey all, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Brandon Kelly. I'm the Associate Director of Debate at Georgetown. So one of their two full-time coaches, in addition to Mikhail Molson, who introduced the debate a moment ago. I'm going to be doing kind of the running commentary over the course of this practice debate. And so obviously you just heard the 1AC. Not a ton to say there, although I will say if you are kind of unsure what's going on or unfamiliar with sentencing or the evidence-based sentencing app in particular, would encourage you to check out both the file for that, which will be available on Open Evidence, as well as optionally the kind of short lecture series that we did on the subject. We'll include a link to that down below. But the one thing I want to flag about the 1AC itself is that it was exceptionally clear. Right, so obviously they weren't kind of going top speed, and nor will the people in the other speeches that you'll hear today. But I would definitely wager that the vast majority of you watching this would not be as clear or sound as good, even if you are kind of slowing down and stuff. And there are a couple of reasons for that, right? So the one thing that's worth noting is that you can understand each and every word, but you can also understand every sentence and the kind of meaning that is imputed in those sentences. So just like you would use intonation naturally when talking to someone to kind of emphasize things and communicate what you mean, Kathy did the same thing kind of throughout the speech, and she isn't doing a bunch of like weird breathing, etc. And so, I definitely would encourage you to kind of model that and try and sound like Kathy sounds, because as you speed up, you want to sound just like that, except faster, and she in particular definitely does. So without further ado, let's get ready for 1ACCX.
All right, so I have some questions about how this plan text works. So require that risk assessments used at sentencing employ algorithmic affirmative action. Does this require affirmative action using an algorithm in every sentencing decision?
In every sentencing decision? So yes, because the equal protection clause would mandate that a precedent is set, which means that in every single sentencing decision.
Gotcha.
That
would judges have any say in this process after the AFF, or is it just whatever the robot says goes as far as the sentence is concerned?
Sure, like judges exist. I think it's a question of assessing risk. So obviously like judges will be like utilized in like the procedural like court process. However, the evaluation of risk specifically will only be used by algorithms, not actual judges.
Can judges ignore the algorithm and completely make their own decision?
No.
Okay. Does the plan force judges to adopt a specific algorithm, or is every court supposed to design their own from the ground up?
Sure. So I would believe, and Darcell can correct me on this, I believe that it's a specific algorithm that utilizes racial inputs. So
okay, let's talk about that algorithm. So let's say that a black person and a white person, both with no previous criminal conviction, no previous interaction with the criminal justice system, same education, next door neighbors, both rob a gas station with a gun. How much longer should the white person's prison sentence be?
Well, our argument would be that they would be the same because both individuals have the same geographic, other like sort of inputs that would be put into this algorithm. All those things are similar.
That's the race neutral approach of looking at this that your current approach is criticizing, because those people have differential risks of being exposed to the criminal justice system due to the racialized nature of policing that your algorithm would propose to be correct for, right?
Sure, yeah. But our argument is that the other inputs that you're talking about, like geographic location, all of those things would be considered the same because they're obviously
right, but the racial factor, which you say needs to be evaluated explicitly, would be different.
Yes.
So
it's like
okay,
yeah.
so assuming all of these proxy factors are the same, race plays no role in the algorithm, is what you're saying.
Well, race would be considered in the algorithm. It's just a question of how it is deployed.
So how is it deployed? It's not at all.
Sure. To so yeah. So to clear things up, our argument is that it is used. However, that the reason that it is effective is because it would result in the same sentencing for those individuals because they do not have because it is not using racialized inputs to kind of detain the black person longer. That is the argument.
I see. So by affirmative action, what you're actually saying is you're taking a race neutral approach. Got it. Okay. So part of why I'm asking about the procedures here is because this is all supposed to apply to the private sector too. So like if I run an insurance company, how do I know if the algorithm I'm using to prorate premiums based on race does so at a sufficient level to satisfy the AFF standard, just for example?
Sure, there would likely be like a standardized algorithm, but additionally, like if
a standardized algorithm for sentencing and for insurance?
Sure, because like
How?
Because those
different issues.
Those inputs, sure, I think cross-example. Okay. Do you want to finish it?
No, you're good.
So Truf is asking some great questions here about, the court having to take this into account, yes, no, about how the algorithm works, etc. You'll notice that he's kind of cutting directly to the core of the AFF and setting himself up well for later. Getting the AFF's answers out there on the record early is critical to determining what strategies are best and also to allowing you to kind of engage them in a great deal of detail earlier rather than later, which is really important because by virtue of the fact that the app speaks last and that the block is in the middle of the debate, late-breaking debates are going to structurally favor the affirmative. Another and kind of related thing that's worth noting here is that he's making an argument, right? When he's asking these questions, he isn't just kind of like fishing for some sort of answer or something. He has a very clear, deep grasp of the issues involved. He's dug into them in advance, and he's making an argument without, crossing into the territory of being hostile or unpleasant, but then being like, explain. So, for example, he's like, explicitly forwards the idea that it would be difficult to apply this stuff to insurance or finance, and then is like, explain how you do that. And that means that the judge is very clearly tuned into what the argument is they're making and why it matters. But it also means that there isn't really any ability for the other team to kind of like, worm their way out of it. Notably also, Kathy handles a lot of this stuff quite well. Some of the answers that they provide here aren't necessarily the right ones, and you'll kind of like see that unfold in some important and strategically impactful ways over the course of this debate, which just goes to show how much of an impact a good CX can have, and on the neg, how important it is to fully plan things out. But even when she doesn't totally know the answer to some of these things about how the algorithm should be designed, about color blindness, etc., she keeps her cool about it and answers in kind of a competent and effective way, and that is a vitally important skill as well.
All right, it's 5 off, and then sentencing, proxy discrimination. I think, yeah. Anyone not good? First off, states and relevant sub-federal governments should require that risk assessments used as sentencing employ algorithmic affirmative action to correct for any isolatable racial bias in the algorithmic outputs, because doing so is required by the Equal Protection Clause. State reform breaks the national fever of punitive criminal justice. Gardner in 19, the Fed is a frequent bad actor in criminal justice reform. Rather than reducing state governments to sites of repression, reformers should appreciate these as a check against federal ambition. Federal achievements obscure the role state governments play in breaking national fever for punishment. This article endorses sub-federal resistance as critical to challenging penal practices, and state control over criminal justice policy is the bedrock of American federalism. Barkow 5. The federal system is based on the bedrock premise that states bear primary responsibility for criminal justice policy. States are better able to ensure communities set sentences according to preferences. Criminal justice is at the core of state responsibility. It's important for Congress to pay close attention to federalism when considering policy. Congress must stay within its sphere because it is wise policy, even when federal jurisdiction is appropriate. And reversal will break the presumption against preemption over state police powers. That's key to coronavirus quarantines. That's Blake and 20. The states use police powers to enforce quarantine laws. The Fed is not keen. Preemption is legally complex. Courts are likely to find against federal preemption of police powers in areas traditionally reserved for the states, such as safety. Quarantines historically fall within states' police powers. That's key to long-term growth. Quarantines now allow quick bounce back to a strong economy. Rampell and 20. Premature opening would be worse for long-run economic growth. It's unanimity among economists. The best way to limit damage would be listen to public health experts, including distancing measures. Demand-side shock would continue. Banning lockdowns will lead to greater economic damage. Saving lives would hasten return to robust economic activity. Social distancing would save $8 trillion in economic benefits. And U.S. growth stalls global recovery and extinction. Alternative is power vacuum conflicts, Haas and 13. America's failure to deal with internal challenges would come at a steeper price. If U.S. growth accelerates, America's capacity to consume, boosting growth around the world. The U.S. remains a unique source of innovation. The world faces spread of WMDs, climate change, and cyberspace, global health, armed conflicts. Order requires leadership. There's only one candidate, the U.S. The U.S. must put its house in order. The alternative is a world not led at all, characterized by conflict. Next off, the AFF is a superficial tweak to a criminal justice system that preserves its legitimacy and co-opts the movement towards structural change. That's Katsanis 19. Emerging criminal justice reform is superficial and deceptive. Reforms would still leave the U.S. as the greatest incarcerator. Those who would want to preserve a current bureaucracy is by making just enough tweaks to preserve perceived legitimacy, obfuscate tweaks that will curb only its most grotesque flourishes. Reform bureaucrats are co-opting a movement. They focus on margins without confronting structural issues. Reform discourse is dangerous. Academics must reject reform discourse to ground every discussion in guiding principles. This rhetorical move perpetuates a racial and white supremacist state violence productive of American globality. That's Rodriguez and 7. The U.S. prison regime is a programmatic condensation of white supremacist state violence. The American prison is fundamental to U.S. state-mediated methods of legitimized violence across the global horizon. Self-evident is the integral role of the U.S. prison regime in American globality. American globality formed through regimes of genocidal violence, war-making, racist state violence, and mass killed in prison. The alternative is to endorse an abolitionist ethic oriented towards substitutive approaches to address societal problems. The alternative must be prioritized to make broader imaginative horizons available. Even if it fails, radical transformation is the best starting point. McLeod 15. Abolitionist ethic identifies completely of a dehumanization of incarceration rather than understanding as superficial flaws. A critical abolitionist centers on how confining humans in a hierarchically structured environment developed through historical practices of overt subordination tends inherently towards violence. An abolitionist ethic is oriented toward displacing criminal law. Displacing criminal regulation entails a primary orientation towards proliferating substitutive approaches to address societal problems, root causes, and interpersonal harm. The reform would in time face challenges. Abolition makes a bolder critical demand which requires more thorough transformation, even if abolition fails in its call for a more marked change by articulating a critical and radically transformative project. Next off, Trump's losing to Biden now, but the election is close. That's Lemon and 20. Biden continues to lead in key swing states nationally, but polls show voters remain undecided. Recent polling showed Biden several points ahead. CGR is a theme of Trump's campaign, but he doesn't have meaningful actions to back it up yet. The plan floats at Sierra Mella and 20. Trump is making CGR a theme. He'll have to do more if he wants to prove he's serious. Trump statements are a notable turnabout. Trump could still do much more. He wants to brag. Substantive CGR beyond the First Step Act flips the election. That's Chung at 19. Criminal justice reform became an issue of the 2020 election. Trump is an opportunist taking advantage. Recent polling from battleground states of Ohio shows 64% believe criminal justice needs improvement. Criminal justice reform must be integral to candidacy instead of a wedge for Trump to explore. Candidates need to develop substantial policy platforms. It's an issue voters care about. Trump re-election triggers every existential impact and makes damage irreversible. Star in 19. Climate change, global arms race of Supreme Court illustrates the significance of 2020. The biggest difference between 16 and 20 would be irreversibility. Costs of delay are mounting. No one knows when the world might hit tipping points. 2020 will determine a stepped-up arms race of risk of nuclear accidents and war. If he's reelected, several countries may opt to pursue nuclear weapons. Trump will go from an aberration to a turning point. Next off, Enact must be Congress' clear intent to define and exclude experiment in 94. Enactment supports suggest legislative action is defined as passing of a bill by a legislator. Violation. The AF uses the Supreme Court to reinterpret the Equal Protection Clause. Vote NEC for limited ground. Courts AFs double the size of a topic, undermining core links to congressional action, eliminating the core CPS and NEC generic. Next off, strict court injunctions on algorithmic discrimination backfire. Turns their case and spills over to massive unintended consequences. And wrecks AI innovation more broadly. That's Casey and 19. Even when the injunction is simple, ordering the robot to change how it thinks is likely to have unintended consequences. If the injunction is set because it's infinite, detecting bias can be less than straightforward. If an algorithm takes account of a prohibited variable like race because that matters in the data, prohibiting consideration could have unanticipated consequences. One, we make the algorithm worse. It turns out you order pretrial algorithms to ignore gender, you end up discriminating against women. These injunctions seem likeliest against newer subsystems. Targeting one component could discourage innovation. With the field of AI improving, we should be willing to experiment. The arc is likely to bend towards better systems, but we won't get there if, of course, are too quick to shut down new systems. AI development minimizes risk and harnesses benefits of emerging technologies. Independently, regulations fail and fears are overblown. Let's begin its intent. That card is not highlighted, so I will just skip that for now. Sentencing. Federal reforms now solving states is impossible. That's Rogers in 18. The FSA reduced sentences under federal law to reduce incarceration does have limitations. Federal prison house only 13%. The rest are state facilities. Our offense outweighs and implicates the greatest number of people to the greatest degree. That's the best metric. Only way to compare without prejudicially devaluing lives and individuals. Algorithms aren't key. They're one of many inputs, meaning they alone can't explain or fix racial sentencing. Actuarial assessments work, studies verify. Duane 17. Risk assessments guide decisions to enhance safety, better use of resources. Tools that inform sentencing rely on algorithms, which include predictors of recidivism. Decades of evidence demonstrated judgment is not good at predicting behavior. Discretion has been linked to worsening racial disparity. Statistical has consistently cleared the bar. The proxy discrimination advantage. No precedent. The conservative court has multiple options to avoid mandating economy-wide affirmative action. Olson and 11. Judges have unlimited discretion distinguishing sentencing from education. The legal system initially Watts Williams. Instead of engaging in ordinary analysis, sentencing courts have swept based on conclusion that sentencing is different than frustrated from review. Evidence-based sentencing relies on risk or survival challenge and equal protection. All causes. COVID dooms businesses, especially minorities, for reasons unrelated to algorithms or lending, and broadly inequality is inevitable. Kemp and Garrison identify white supremacist ideology, ecological harms, peak oil famine, and randomness as societal collapse risk. Algorithms can't undo both. No econ impact. COVID-proof states are turning inwards because they fear the cost of fighting a war. Decline doesn't cause terrorism. They're dying from no healthcare and can't get to the U.S. due to travel bans. Auditing algorithms requires revealing their workings. That lets them get gamed, which undermines algorithmic affirmative action. Hosengarner and 18. Algorithms today are for profit and remain in a black box. Transparency makes algorithms vulnerable to gaming. AI is making source code less relevant. It involves reams of data only being able to guess. And I'm good for cross-X.
So you just heard the one in C. Zidao is, similarly clear, sounds great. One thing worth noting is that on the case, you should have numbered. For those of you kind of flowing at home, I think that you will absolutely kind of notice that some of those arguments begin to kind of bleed into each other a little bit, and it will be much clearer if you're going through and you're like, one, argument, two, argument. Additionally, it's worth noting that for purposes of this practice debate, there were some kind of core strategies we wanted to get out there, and part of this also is related to kind of that CX of the 1AC in ways that, again, you'll see before long. But in general, you would want the 1C against an affirmative like this to include some other strategies as well. In particular, you would want to test whether the precedent and the topic area are both kind of intimately connected, right? By counterplanning out of each one of those and reading a DA to the other one. So like a DA to the court and a DA to the particular change they make to the algorithms themselves. All right, CX.
First, let's talk about, I think it's the Barstow evidence you're reading on the state's counterplan. In the parts you chose not to highlight, or it's the barcode card, sorry. The parts you chose not to highlight, it says, however, the importance of federalism has often been overshadowed by short-sighted political concerns. In particular, there's been unprecedented expansion of federal criminal law into areas traditionally leftist states. And then it goes on to cite like a bunch of examples of this occurring in the past. So my question is, why is the plan's like encroachment into federal, or I guess, why are previous numerous encroachments into federalism sufficient to trigger the net benefit, but not the plan, or but the plan is?
Well, sure. So that's the uniqueness argument, which is that the federal government consistently sort of intrudes in those areas. The Gardner evidence says that if a state were to sort of stand up against the federal government and act as a check against ambition, then that would cause the follow-on of a future where states are more likely to do so because they have more political willpower to see that it's possible.
Sure. The net benefit, I think it's the Rampel card, I think it's the Rampel card. It says that reopening businesses now would be worse for the economy. Where does it make the reverse causal claim that it would revamp the economy if we don't open them?
Well, obviously, the economy is not like revamping immediately, but our argument is not that the economy has to like start right now. The Haas card is like comparative. It says that U.S. growth in the long term is good, and that we have to be, growing faster
I
than China and
understand that,
Russia.
but where does it say that it contributes to U.S. growth? Like, I think you have the argument that it's in the other direction, where it says it would make it worse if we do open. Where does it say if we do not do
this
that,
is
it
the
would
only
improve?
the coronavirus is the only thing that is going to inhibit U.S. growth now. The Rampel card says if we prematurely open, it would be worse for long run economic growth. Absent that, you have to introduce an argument about why you think growth would not continue. Our argument is that
Sure.
we have to grow faster than China and Russia.
Sure, I want
Everyone's
to move
weak
on
now
to
because
the
of
elections
COVID.
dissad. So, first question is, how is Trump tied to the courts?
Well, one is just the kind of argument that he takes credit for a lot of the things the courts does, and the second is the argument that the courts itself are political and therefore
he just
would be
tweeted
part of the
about like
election.
20 Supreme Court decisions that just happened and said he was not responsible for any of them.
Claims to conservative credibility is his justice appointments.
Sure. The Kyra Melli evidence, basically, I think it's the link argument. First of all, Trump has obviously messed up on criminal justice reform, like nationwide, constantly. I'm confused why the plan would reverse that trend.
Well, so this evidence, two things. So one is that the things he's messed up on don't matter as much because of how big the plan is.
What do you mean they don't matter?
And the second thing is that voters generally, when they see something that he's messed up on, they don't care as much as if they see something that he's done well on, because he's messed up on so many things. But if he's able to, flip this, then it's sufficient. Also, we don't have to flip like all the voters, but we've made an argument that there's like a small amount that, might not turn out as much or might not be as pissed at Trump if a plan happens. So it's not like they vote for Trump, but it's that they don't vote for Biden or they don't turn out in large enough numbers.
So here we have another really solid CX, in which the person asking the questions is really more making an argument and taking kind of full advantage of the speech time. CX, if you handle it properly, has the potential to be some of your best speeches in the debate because it gives you an opportunity to make additional arguments, but in a way that the other team has to respond to directly, and it kind of gets it right in front of the judge's attention, right? So Kathy is like, where is the reverse causal warrant? Where does it say it contributes to U.S. growth? And those things really, they're questions, but they really have kind of a sentence, or they really have kind of a period at the end, right? What she's actually saying here is this is not a reverse causal thing. And, Zidao then kind of starts in on his whole, doesn't revitalize the economy immediately, blah, blah, blah. And Kathy, as with CX of the one, as Truth does in CX of the 1EC, politely but firmly retains control of the CX, right? So she jumps in, she says, sure, but where does it say that it's key to growth, right? So it's like you want to not let them kind of run away with it. On the other side, Zidao clearly understands the DAs, which is super important. And a bunch of the CXs and 1Cs that I see, the 1N does not equip themselves super well. And so this is kind of a model of what you want to do. He's not just having truth answer at all, but nor, importantly, is he being super evasive or something. He's instead directly answering the arguments that Kathy is using CX to make. The reason that's important is because it really kind of firms up your credibility, not just as an individual debater, but of your position as a whole, right? In much as, like, this is speech time for you too, and you want to use it that way. So, for example, Kathy is, whether it's alt causes versus the Federalism DA, or this stuff about coronavirus and economic growth and reverse causality, or the kind of various 2EC answers to the politics DA that are being previewed here, right, in terms of why people care about the court and stuff. Each one of those things, Zidao is not just waxing poetic about and expanding at length, nor is he dodging them. He is instead directly being like, here's the argument, here are the warrants, in kind of a succinct, effective way, just like any good speech, right? So for example, the narrative on elections is crystal clear to me. That means that if in the 2AC, they don't adapt to that and answer the argument as it was presented here, they'll be behind. If instead they do, and use this as an opportunity to kind of pin the neg down early in the debate, then they'll be in a great spot and they'll be ahead, right? So you need to be on the same page with your partner as well. The 2A needs to know what sets of things were established here and deal with them. And similarly, the 1A needs to know, like, here are the weak points that my 2A partner is going to want to push on. I'll need to kind of like, nail this down. Because like we said earlier, it's like late breaking debates generally are going to be better for the neg, but at the same time, you also don't want if you're AF, you don't want the neg in the 1NR to be able to kind of reinvent the wheel and put together a new, essentially write a new narrative for the politics DA in light of what your 2EC didn't say, because then they can kind of frame things out and make them less relevant stuff. So you want to get them on the page, on the record early and deal with their arguments. I think they did a good job of that here. All right. 2AC.
So the order is, I'm going to start with the overview at the top. I'm going to go sentencing, then proxy discrimination, then I'll go T, the abolition critique, states counterplan, elections DA, and then an AI term at the bottom. Okay. Everybody good? Cool. The Equal Protection Clause currently prohibits the ability of use of algorithms and risk assessment to challenge racial bias in sentencing processes. The plan is key to revise the EPC in order to challenge racial disparities in CJR. That's Yang in print. Algorithmic affirmative action is crucial in order to reverse the deep racial disparities that is present in our prison system and must be ethically rejected on face. That's our MEMI evidence. AI is already being developed and risks having racial biases encoded into the proxy systems, which inevitably worsens the already collapsing social sphere, both in the US and globally, as well as ensures future biases will occur. This in line to have to be implemented shows that the US is complicit with its white supremacist nature with further societal collapse, which will go global and lead to extinction. That's our Harrison and Kemp evidence. And new AI developments will need proxy inputs that challenges bias, crucial to promote anti-discriminatory practices in the global market, which is key to economic growth. Continued discrimination stagnates U.S. competitiveness and growth, hampering the ability for minority businesses to grow and collapsing the economy. This will lead to the exacerbation of inequality, heighten the risk of terror, and increase the likelihood of World War III leading to global extinction, as Bradley, Klein, and Liu. On its sentences, they say school solves the school currently locks in algorithmic bias in federal reform, which is key to challenging state bias. They say util, but one, we access your framework through our econ impact, and racial disparities lead to social collapse, which causes global instability. That's an overview. And second, racial discrimination is happening now. Justification for theoretical scenario shouldn't be weighed and is complicit with anti-black logic. They say it's not key, but it is. Our Thomas evidence says that specifically data bias utilizing EBS now will continue to worsen the disparity gap and incarceration for minorities. And they say algorithms are key, but this art proves our point. It says that they utilize algorithms for risk assessments, but Black individuals are always seen as major risks in society. This app is key to check that data bias. And they say on the proxy discrimination, They say no internal link, but yes, there's precedent. The card flows out because it is speaking in the context of the scroll. The app solves the nuanced ways in which bias can overcome through algorithms and consists of the latest evidence goes app. Their studies are outdated. That's humor 20. While judges do not rely entirely on algorithms determining the sentence, and recent research suggests that humans may unconsciously trust algorithms more than we realize. 6 recent studies found that the participants relied on more identical evidence than they thought they would that came from algorithms when it came from other people. Mounting evidence suggests that algorithms can play a bigger role in human decision making than we have been willing to admit. They say all causes of COVID is only short term, while the legal system has both short and long term implications. And we agree that app doesn't change the mindset of white supremacists, but the app does eliminate biases and proxy servers that help to uphold the prison industrial complex. That's Prince. And yes, the econ impact. States are moving inward from COVID responses because of lack of federal direction. And yes, terror, our new evidence cites that terror can arrive domestically from minority groups or abroad. They say game, but one, this is in the context of scroll bias, and two, gaming won't destroy the app post-plan because the EBC won't ensure it can be revised if new outputs won't revise algorithm bias and sentencing on the T. Enact means to legally establish or make law, which the courts do. Restricting it to legislators only arbitrary, unpredictable, and imprecise. That's right 13. Plain language does not combine the enactment of law to legislative enactments of the text and does not limit enactments to the legislative enactments. Enactments not defined or is generally thought of as an actually unique to legislatures. Court that commonly refers to the court enacted rules. The Delaware Supreme Court is a reference to state statute or rule. The court enacted authority under law. The plethora of these examples indicate the court has not restricted the ability to enact the law in the legislature. No violation. Of course, enacted EBS is within the grounds of their jurisdiction and unlimited ground. The ability to enact is consistent with the courts determining if a law is unconstitutional. Disallowing court apps to enact the new law reforms destroy over half of the topic. It shifts ground in favor of the app. Overlimiting app choice will wreck education on certain issues and the process in which we implemented new laws in CJR onto the K. First, weigh the impacts of the app against the critique, and consequences must be evaluated. Insistence on principles as the end in itself ensures that the alternative fails. That's Brace 6. Reducing conversation to an ideological context allows the opponents to ally in inquiry and whether the results of particular policy is desirable. Critics may point to the colorblindness and the practice of defecting the interest in the existing racial disparities, but in the framing of the debate purely ideological terms, opponents are able to avoid the contentious issues of outcomes and make viability determines based exclusively on whether racially progressive measures exclude fidelity and ideological principle of colorblindness. And the case solves the critique. EBS reform is consistent with abolitionist ethics and firm to the plan and endorse abolitionist ethics. Short-term material reforms are necessary, can be connected to the long-term aims of abolition. That's -11. Resisting on a carceral state requires that organized scholars to practice the both end of social services and social change. Services are desperately needed. Short-term reforms are needed to address the real conditions and real needs to actual people caught in the system. Simultaneous reforms is required because there are real bodies in need and immediate resources. Faith reminds us of the necessity of doing both and where it days the local work may involve in engaging reforms, but it's also useful to place to understand and connect these reforms to a larger movement. And the whole links to decay. Just endorsing the abolition of ethics doesn't materially change CJR. It continues the complicit nature of racial injustice. And abolition K links to the state's counterplan and its perf-con. Performative contradictions are particularly bad. It makes it impossible to have a stable app offense because our offense on one flow could be the links or benefits to other positions will always benefits the negative by minimizing strategic app offense onto the state's counterplan. Follow on isn't automatic. If that can backlash on conditioning funding and compliance with federal law, that's Garner 19. The start of the protest is now ensure that its completion of decision by a sub-federal government to abstain from the participation in a federal criminal initiative will not necessarily result in abolition of federal initiative, mimicry and other sub-state federal governments and nullification of federal initiative, and firm de both overlapping federal and state criminal statutes don't link to federalism. That's Ashdown 96. The point must be to emphasize that dual or overlapping jurisdiction does not trigger the debate. Dual jurisdiction is often essential. And firm to the counterplan, federal government includes the state governments in the shared division of power. Washington, D.C. is the central government. It's Legal Dictionary 16. A federal government is a system that divides power between the larger central government and local regional governments beneath the U.S. and the federal government's powers were established by the Constitution. And uniform state action is not realistic. The proposal is not grounded in the literature. That's Barco 5. It's difficult to speak to the states as uniform black when it comes to any subject that sentencing is no exception. Not all states have been moving in the direction of reducing incarceration. And their blatant evidence says nothing about the plan uniquely being keep state federalism. Quarantine law isn't affected by CJR. And coronavirus only affected the economy because of lack of federal initiative was only a short-term shock. Cross-apply argument from the case law. And we have a better internal link to the economy. Extend Bradley and Rubin's that discriminatory practices stagnate growth and competitiveness because minority groups don't have the ability to create businesses that are key to the economy. This is more true than the short-term stall of the corona and it's screwed by the status quo because businesses are already opening back up on elections. Betting markets say Trump will win and COVID and the economy outweigh. That's Roebling 20. Even after the White House delayed a response to the coronavirus, there were investors at betting markets still putting their money on Trump. The world's most popular betting destination show that Trump is a clear favorite. And the wild card is the virus. And the election is key to be a referendum about how Trump handles the pandemic, whether he's pushed to restart the economy, got the U.S. back on track or drove a second wave of infection that did even more damage. And COVID outweighs every other issue that's left in 2020. The pandemic is likely to be an overarching issue of the pandemic eclipsing other issues. And now the question is going to be both about the blame of the economy and the blame for response to the pandemic. The effect is going to be huge. First, no link. Trump can't get credit for the courts. And no internal link. Their chunk evidence only says Ohio is key, but doesn't mention other swing states. No brink. Their own SAR evidence takes out their impact and says that there's no time frame for collapse. In the most likely worst scenario, post-states their evidence and no impact to Trump's second term. He'll be too weak politically. That's Galactus 20. A second term Trump would not be apocalyptic direct scenarios. Unlikely if Trump was able to continue to pack the courts with conservatives, but that presumes that the GOP holds the Senate. The second term president always finds himself in a weaker position. Even presidents who appear invisible can suffer irreparable damage. Now, his base support will shrink whether his party will get wiped out in the midterm. The House will impeach him again, and this time votes will be there in the Senate to get convicted onto the AI term. No link to Apple would be affected by all sectors, and AI is only contingent upon checking upon outputs of racial bias and EBS. But even if being careful is good and not bad, that's equal 17. The slow process of developing risk tools is not necessarily as a bad thing. As the tools are developing without much caution, the criminal justice system has survived a long term without predictive tools. Slow down creation and adoption of tools can promote reflection about their construction and use, and turn backlash will wreck innovation and uptake. That's 17. Opaque and potentially biased mathematical models are remaking our lives, and neither company is responsible for developing them, nor the government and interest in addressing the problem. Algorithm bias is shaping what could be a major societal issue at a critical moment. The eventual outcry might stymie the progress of the incredible use of tech. A key challenge that is crucial to stakeholders showing an interest in monitoring and limiting algorithm bias. O'Neill says that even those who know that their algorithms are based on risk and bias is more interested in the bottom line than rooting out the bias. She says, I have no clients right now. And I'm open for cross-sects.
All right, so those are really solid 2AC. Obviously, Darcell, as with all these people, is not going at top speed. However, this is another excellent model of sounding great, right? He is saying exactly what he means. It's very efficient and tight. It's very substantive and packed with warrants. He is, very clear, obviously, but also is speaking with some kind of gravitas and authority, which does matter, right? You fundamentally, the credibility of whatever your argument you're making is influenced to a significant degree, both by how the judge understands it, which is partly a function of vocal cues, and also by how, credible you seem to be and how credible the argument seems to be. Even your kind of ultimate flow-focused judge is not a robot. Substantively, there are some things going on that are really important here. So, number one, Darcell did a great job of kind of creating evidence and blocks with pointing out obvious flaws in the negative's position, especially with the elections DA. That is critical, and it's a thing that you and your 2ACs must be doing. Every single one of you needs to be doing more of that. One thing that was not said that will become kind of very important is that the states get overruled if they do something that the federal court thinks is racist. That is a kind of core part of the argument for this affirmative right, is that it's unconstitutional for either Congress or the states to kind of go ahead and do the AF because of the fact that right now it would be understood to violate the Equal Protection Clause. That's part of why the AF is written the way it is, right? So that there's a strong inbuilt answer to states because the states kind of wouldn't be unconstitutional. That will matter a great deal in this debate. It also, to some degree, has its roots in CX of the 1EC, right? Which gets back to the point earlier about kind of like having a clear strategy and taking full advantage of what the other team does and doesn't say. Similarly, there's not a ton, in CX of the 1EC earlier, there were some issues about revolving around NCX of the 1NC as well, revolving around like how do you get the judges to do these things that you want them to do, and how do you ensure that the algorithms are effective and not catastrophic and all those sorts of things. And the 2AC did not do as much as it could have there, either in terms of kind of resolving, getting out ahead of and resolving those potential concerns. So a couple of things to keep in mind, because both those will kind of manifest later in the debate. So yeah, overall, really great 2AC, but also a really good example of, a really good example to look at in terms of like what matters, what says matters a great, or what is said matters a great deal, but what is not said also matters when you're debating a really good NIC team.
Okay, cool. So let's discuss the spillover internal link for the second advantage. What's the warrant for why the courts would apply the precedent more broadly?
You said, sorry, you said what is the
Yeah, what's the warrant for why the courts would apply the precedent set in sentencing to things like finance?
Yeah, sure. We think that Yeah, so first you can look at the Prince evidence, which pretty much talks about how it's obviously necessary to be able to challenge the EPC because of the current wage they're using in the status quo, and it specifically insights the way that it's used.
Yeah, but Prince evidence says that there's proxy discrimination in those sectors, but what evidence says the plan causes the courts to say that affirmative action is required in those sectors?
Sure, yeah. Well, one, we think the plan necessarily resolve that. I don't think we need a key specific piece of warrant or evidence to respond to that. But again, I think the Prince evidence is pretty indicative of the fact that if one is necessary and two, that it will be effective.
Because like we've read a card that's like in sentencing, the courts can distinguish all the time. And in fact, they always hold that stuff that applies in sentencing doesn't apply to other areas.
Sure, but we also read a piece of 2AC evidence that talks about specifically why they actually do infer, or at least why they actually use algorithms more than they assume that they do. I think that the Humor 20 evidence, yeah.
Also, like the 1 and C evidence would be just describing the status quo where the courts distinguish now, but if the precedent is set, it would obviously apply to other areas.
Well, I guess I'm wondering why the obviously part is like so obvious.
Well, because the Equal Protection Clause, ruling under the Equal Protection Clause would mandate that those race like neutral inputs would not be allowed. So if that is mandated, that means in other areas in which they are trying to use those algorithmic inputs, it could not be utilized.
Okay, sure. Topicality, the Enact definition, the right card is a JD from UMich. Why does this person why does this person get to define Enact? Why is this person predictable for?
Yeah, sure. I get one. I mean,
rules.
Of the author, one, obviously, I think they're credible enough to talk about that. But second, it gives very contextual examples in which one, the Delaware Supreme Court and other courts actually prove that the courts are able to enact, and that it is not specifically kind of relegated to the executive or the legislature. Okay. So even if you want to attack the author, right, there are kind of like historical examples that prove that we're more right.
Yeah. Midterms is that the Glastress card that says no impact to Trump's second term seems to be discussing like Congress being pretty bad and him not being able to pass bills. Our internal link was about foreign policy and treaty withdrawal. Those things are relatively unimpeded by Congress.
Also talks about that Trump is already in a weaker position to be able to do those things, but it talks about how in the second term it would easily be able to be vetoed because he would not have the power that he originally.
How can Congress veto our thing was like allied perception of Trump being elected is bad. Like what can Congress do to stop that?
Well, easily, yeah. The way in which the Senate and everybody backed him, one, in response to him being indicted on obviously the meddling with election and other things, will prove that when we have a new Congress that would favor a more democratic kind of like process, then yeah, they will be able to check him. And also, just historically, second-term presidents aren't able to be able to get away with the things that he was in the first term. So,
sure. Yeah, that's time.
Okay, so 2ACCX. This line of questioning about precedent is quite important. Either the AF doesn't solve, or you, especially in light of the earlier CX about the algorithms and how they work or don't work and the workability issues of applying this ruling to a bunch of different areas and stuff, you've set up a great link, right? And have also established what's necessary and sufficient to solve the precedent advantage. So if you also are counterpointing out of it, or in this case, having the states do it, then that's really useful as well. Note the formula he uses here, as with some of those earlier CXs. Here's our argument for why they wouldn't apply it. Now answer that, right? As opposed to, why would they apply it? The other kind of couple big threads that go on here, there's a question that tees up the topicality stuff quite effectively by kind of impugning and making an central issue of the 2AC author's credibility. Watch for that in the 2 and C, it's going to matter. Additionally, a question that differentiates their kind of impactee card from the 1 and C impact by digging into the warrants themselves and being like, you know, your evidence is about this thing, why does that deal with this other thing? Where again, what's really being done is an argument is being forwarded that is, you know, while giving the other team an opportunity to respond to it, because the other team getting the chance to respond to it is good and useful because it nails down what their answer is going to be. So it's like either you kind of make the impact defense or whatever go away, in which case you're in great shape, or the judge is, in tune with you now on what the issue with that card is. Their explanation might be unsatisfying, in which case great, or they might have like some sort of good answer, and then you know what the 1AR is going to say, so you can beat that argument before they make it, right? So watch out for each one of those threads in the 2NC 1NR. They will all make an appearance, and they will all matter. Some of them, or each of them really, in the 2NR as well.
Topicality, the abolition K, the state's counterplan, the AI disad, the sentencing advantage, and then the proxy discrimination advantage. We all good? You all saw where I sent the file on the thing for the 2NC? Okay. Topical AFs must use a congressional actor, not the court, which is our Berman evidence. You should prefer it. 1, it's more qualified because it's a judge making a ruling while theirs is just a JD. And 2 is legal precision. Our interpretation is at the center of our constitutional system. That's Fowler 16. The founders balanced government. According to this model, courts cannot enact, only interpret. Only lawmakers write laws. 3, neg ground. Uncontroversial harms and mechanism means that stable ground about the agent is the only way for the neg to get back in the game. 4, resolutional context. Even if fringe cases of enactment can be done by courts, substantial means you should limit those out. Cottrell 6. Substantial being in the main, relating to the main part of something. And they don't meet their interpretation because Wright says court-enacted rules of evidence are topical, not that broad court rulings constitute enactments. Independently, they increase sentences for white people, which isn't sentencing reform. NYT 16. Significant criminal justice reform would reduce sentences. Sentencing reform represents progress in harsh punishment by shortening sentences. They say they meet, that's wrong. They have the court do something which we've excluded. They say they're better for ground. We keep all of the same substantive ground. Congress can even direct the court to do stuff. Congress just has to be involved. There are plenty of reasons why Congress is key. There are political, jurisdictional, funding-based reasons, etc. All of those answer counterplans that are based off of this topicality argument. They say it's good for education. We solve their education arguments because we cover the same substantive areas, just require an agent. Remember, no reasonability argument in the 2AC means that even if our interpretation is only a tiny bit better, you still vote negative. Abolition K. Concede the perm, just a test of competition. We're not going for it. State's counterplan. It solves the case because it creates new sentencing standards and spills up to federal action, but it avoids the political costs of federal action before an election. It also avoids federalism. That outweighs. It turns the economy because it's key to empower state COVID responses. That matters more for their Liu impact evidence, which is about short-term collapse rather than long-term sustainability like their internal link is about. Federalism solves global war, Lawadi 9. Covering 100 countries, federalism minimizes conflicts. Among 223 groups, stifles high-level conflicts, dampens rebellions, undermines militants, reducing conflicts out of resources, end insurgencies, and averts separatism. They say no follow-on. Wrong. Our card is from the same author, and it says that state action ratchets up the pressure on the feds to act. Their card is a caveat to our card, and it says that in fringe cases, the process can get derailed, but it works most of the time, which is the 1NC card. There is follow-on, Esposito 20. By analyzing state reforms, the federal system can make a similar approach. Examples of states are powerful. State work encourages progress. The national focus is turned to federal. That is an incomplete story. Most criminal justice happens at the state level, despite overreaches. They say perm do both. It links to elections because the federal government acts, which empowers Trump's spin. It also links to federalism, despite alignment between states and feds, because it removes state discretion, even if states happen to agree in this instant, which is their own solvency evidence, and Barkow 5. States bear responsibility for crime. To be consistent with the Constitution, federal law should duplicate state criminal law only when state enforcement is inadequate. They say perm do the counterplan. It severs federal action, which is a voting issue for ground, and it means that the permutation does not justify including the plan. 1, the definite article proves. The plan says the federal government acts. That means there's only one. It's the one in DC, even if broadly the US has a federal system, which means both states and federal governments, which is what their card is talking about. 2, it's the 3 branches in DC and not the states. US legal no date. USFG has 3 branches. Powers not federal are to the states. They say it's unrealistic. That's irrelevant because fiat has the states act in concert. They did not connect this card to a theory argument, so there's no broader implication. State fiat is good. It tests whether the federal government should act, and it creates good debates about federalism. They say no spillover to broader federalism. There is spillover because crime is a police power, much like COVID, meaning that the two are doctrinally linked by court decisions. Courts would refer to the plan to rein in state healthcare efforts, which is the Blake evidence. Finally, they answer the economy internal link. We extended that in the overview. Our internal link outweighs because it's shorter and has a broader magnitude. The AI dissent. concede all of their arguments. I know that it's a straight turn. That does not matter because I'm going for the counterplan, which solves 100% of this. Their whole straight turn just says there needs to be regulation of AI. The counterplan clearly does this at the state level, and they have no reason why the states cannot be as effective at doing this as the federal government. The sentencing advantage. Extend 1 and C1, the state's alt cause. This Rogers evidence says that the federal government only does 13% of criminal justice related efforts, and it says that the First Step Act, which was a federal effort, proves that there are jurisdictional limits to these arguments. They say the feds can cause states to act, but that's wrong because the feds cannot affect state sentencing due to the 10th Amendment. That gap is 2 million people, which is huge. That's EJI 19. Federal sentencing reform alone will not solve the mass incarceration dilemma. If prisons released every federal prisoner tomorrow, 2 million would remain behind bars in the states. Next, extend 1 and C2, utilitarianism. Saving the most lives is the only ethical way to make policy. It's actually more anti-Black to devalue lives in a targeted way, because if they're right about society, any such prioritization will always be twisted in an anti-Black way. Valuing Black lives equally is the best, because it provides grounds for that argument for equality in a universally accessible emancipatory language. Additionally, nuclear war is anti-Black because Black people have the fewest options to respond and live in targeted urban centers. But inverting the hierarchy by devaluing the lives lost in a nuclear conflict is worse because it obliterates the individuality of every single person who dies. And extinction is categorically different because it's irreversible, and because each of us owes a categorical custodial duty to the human race to preserve potentially infinite future generations. The proxy discrimination advantage. Extend the first argument that there's no precedent. I'm mostly going to talk about this because it's a crush, and nothing the 2AC said in response to this argument was an answer. There is zero internal link to solving inequality broadly across the entire economy because courts will not choose to apply the precedent set by the plan in other contexts in the economy. First, sentencing is legally distinct, which prevents spillover. Williams v. New York, Mitchell v. United States, US v. Watts, all distinguish sentencing from other racial discrimination cases based on the unique need for personalized decision-making in this context. That's the Olson evidence. Second, even if there aren't legal reasons to prevent spillover, the conservative court would limit the case to its facts for political reasons, since Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Roberts, etc. would do literally anything to avoid mandating affirmative action across the entire economy. Third, even if the court does make a mandate, enforcement and implementation would take decades. School desegregation still hasn't happened, and it's been decades since Brown v. Board. The affirmatives reform is much more drastic than even that, because it's not just schools. It reforms the entire private sector across literally every single portion of the economy. Every company would have to create their own AI. Literally hundreds of legal challenges would have to be resolved about which AIs correct sufficiently for racial discrimination and which don't, across hundreds and thousands of different sectors of the economy. That takes years to litigate and decades longer to implement. They say they overcome bias as a response to this. I don't know how that's an answer to anything that I've just said. They say there's a consensus. This card just says that humans rely on algorithms more than they realize, which has absolutely nothing to do with our precedent argument. Explicit Supreme Court doctrine is to distinguish sentencing from other areas. Hamilton 15. To date, the best reading of explicit Supreme Court doctrine indicates that law and review does not apply to sentencing. And the court does it all the time. That's Hessek 11. Courts often reject challenges to sentencing because of the ipse dixit that sentencing is different. Instead of examining the constitutional provision, as in any other part, rationales support sentencing exceptionalism. It is a long-established practice not to recognize rights at sentencing. Extend 1 and C2 that COVID kills businesses. They concede that this is true, but they say that laws will matter laws will matter more in the long run, but that's irrelevant because the short-term thumper is enough to trigger their Liu evidence, which is the only impact they've read, which is about an immediate economic collapse, not about sustainable growth. Finally, extend 1 and C number 3, that bias and social unsustainability make their impact inevitable and that inequality from algorithms is not key. They only said they fixed prisons, but that's a drop in the bucket compared to broader civilization, which is fundamentally inequitable, so they can't solve. I'm ready for cross-ex.
So this 2 and C, I think, was excellent, just pretty phenomenal. And there are a bunch of reasons for this. So let's kind of go through each of the sheets of paper. So topicality, first, I want everyone to kind of take note of this 2 and C on T. The arguments for topicality at the top here are incredibly information dense, right? So truth is going no faster than conversational speed. But each of these arguments is incredibly efficient. They aren't a lot of words, but they also aren't blippy because each one of them has a very clear warrant. It's very fully fleshed out. It's impacted out. And that's the way you want to be debating any argument, not just T, but this is kind of a masterclass in my view of how you want to be extending and debating T. On states, similarly, Truth does a really phenomenal job of kind of doing internal link comparison for the federalism net benefit, right? So when people talk about impact calculus, often the way I see that play out just kind of devolves into like, oh, probability more important than magnitude or whatever. Some of that stuff can matter sometimes, but the way more important thing is like, you are forwarding a set of truth claims about the world. So are they. Compare those things, resolve those things. If you're right about this set of stuff, why does that matter for the set of kind of offensive arguments that they're forwarding? Similarly, kind of throughout this sheet of paper, Truth does a great job of providing warranted explanations and comparisons, not just kind of forwarding the argument, right? So for example, versus follow-on, he goes through and he explains, I would encourage you to rewatch, each of these snippets that I'm discussing. He goes through versus follow-on and explains and synthesizes those arguments together. Even if they're right about this set of warrants, here's our answer, or here's why they are still wrong. Similarly, like, it also links to federalism despite alignment because, right? So what that does is, 2AC is like perm, shields, whatever. The 2NC doesn't just say links to the DAs, still has the federal government act until it states what to do or whatever. Instead, he says it links to federalism despite the fact that they are in alignment because, and what he's doing there is he's preempting the version of the argument that the 1AR and 2AR are going to make, right? Undercutting the credibility of the argument before they make it in the first instance, which is critically important. The AIDA, great example of a way of kind of proactively of knowing what strategies you want to keep alive. So topicality obviously is a self-contained 2NR, but otherwise they can go for states and one of these two net benefits. That's a really great, or one of those DAs in the case. And that's a really great spot to be in. There are several kind of self-sufficient 2NRs here, each one of which is quite good. But that means that you don't need to keep everything alive. And most importantly, it's pretty clear that they don't want to go for the status quo, which means, especially given the limits on how much stuff they can say, that it's not really worth it to try and extend the AIDA and keep it alive. And so even though it's straight turned, they like, that's irrelevant, counterpoint solves it, etc. And doesn't stop there, right? So one could imagine a version of this where he's like, counterpoint solves a straight turn, next page. But instead he explains why to prevent any possibility of weirdness later. The 1AR then doesn't have anything to kind of latch onto. The judge isn't stuck sitting there trying to figure out like why this made sense or why they're not in trouble. And it means that the F does want to make something of it. The burden on them is much higher to explain very clearly why this argument for the counterpoint makes it go away is wrong, which then means the 2NR will have a good chance to respond to it. And so finally, this case stuff, this is, again, an excellent model of how you want to approach this. 1NC1, 1NC2, an explanation of the arguments, kind of explaining and impacting out each of the different arguments. Additionally, all these arguments about, for example, it's a sweeping mandate for all the private sector, need to figure out everyone's algorithm and stuff. Remember, I said earlier, after 1ACCX, that some of the ways these things were discussed and some of the things that weren't answered are a little bit off base, right? So these things shouldn't be true, but in light of the way that the AF has debated it so far, they are true, and Truth recognized this and is taking full advantage of it. And that's what you need to be doing on both sides in your debates as well.
Yep. First question I have, you make a question about legal precision, or at least let me step back. Your argument, or in terms of why you think you're right on T, is the credibility, but not the context of the Delaware courts that we've already mentioned that proves that they actually enacted through the precedent of ruling on something. How is that responsive because your author is a judge?
Well, our author is a more qualified individual than your author. Both of them are kind of assembling definitions from across the literature and determining which ones are the most precise, but our author is more qualified to do that since your author is just a law student. But also the definitions that your author chose to assemble are just random cards from dictionaries like Merriam-Webster, whereas ours is about the legal application.
Our author is literally talking about specific context in which the courts did enact something through the precedent of ruling on something. How is credibility
but the justification for calling those things an enactment is his citation of the Merriam-Webster dictionary, which the only basis for trusting his application of that is his qualifications as a law student. Our authors doing the same thing, and they're more qualified because they have an established legal career and they actually make law, which means
That's
that
fine.
theirs actually has legal force.
On the counterplan, your argument to the 50 states via ARG saying that that's irrelevant was, I mean, how is it responsible to the world where courts, specifically on the state level, one, uniquely deal with court cases in a different way? They have their own precedent. I don't see how it's saying that it's like, how is it's irrelevant in response to the world where they all act uniformly.
I'm sorry, I didn't follow your question.
Your argument or response to the 50 states via argument is saying that it's irrelevant because of, I guess they'll follow on. I don't really know what your
Oh,
argument
sorry. Yeah, I understand what you're asking now. So
Yeah.
you said that it's unrealistic.
Yeah.
We said that it is good to test the federal and state action, which means that it's important to equalize all the other variables, such as uniformity. So it doesn't matter if it's unrealistic. And you never actually connected any of your arguments for why it's unrealistic to an interpretation. And uniform fiat resolves the realisticness objection to state action.
Okay, so permanent counterplan, you said it severs federal action. We've made an argument that states are inclusive of the central act of the federal government doing so because they will follow on. How is that severing out? If we do it through the
Well,
federal.
follow-on is not a component of the counterplan, since the counterplan does not fiat that the federal government does anything. We have some additional arguments for why states and federal actors are distinct. One is because your plan text says the federal government with a definite article, which implies only one, and two, because of the constitutional definition, which says that the USFG is the government in DC.
Yeah, okay. So also, I guess going on to the precedent internal link stuff, we specifically read a card, which is the Humeric evidence that talks specifically about how the way in which courts determine risk assessment is heavily dependent on how algorithms for risk assessment is already happening. Your argument is saying that we don't have an internal link because the card is saying that they rely on it more, but y'all's argument from the first place was saying that they would not use it and conservative courts would find their way out of or use kind of their own ability to kind of sever out.
Your card says they're biased now. For you to win, you solve throughout the economy, you have to win there's a spillover. Arg is that doesn't happen.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
Right, 2 and CCX. So I don't have a lot that I want to say here. One thing I do want to flag, though, is the exchange that happens about the T author. So, you know, obviously, as I think Truth 2 and C makes quite clear, a huge part of the argument is about legal precision and predictability for the app, or for the neg, right? At minimum, you want to establish that it's, you know, quite predictable and precise, such that it justifies drawing this line for other reasons, for kind of, you know, fairness reasons or whatever. And in contrast, the app wants to establish that this is like a somewhat arbitrary limit to draw, that it's, you know, even if it's a distinction that's drawn in some contexts, it's not a very predictable one to draw here. But this exchange about the author that happens, Truth is like, look, both of them are surveying the existing literature on this thing. You're right about that. But our author is more qualified to do that because this person is a judge, your author is a law student. Now, most debates, especially in high school that I see, the idea of kind of indicting an author's qualifications because they're a JD or whatever is not a thing that would kind of register or just be kind of like assertive. But here, what Truth is doing is identifying why we should or should not believe a given person or author or authority about a specific issue and making that matter, right? So the reason author qualifications matter is not because they are important in a vacuum. It's because there's a fundamental question of like why we should believe them about X thing. And here, the answer is this judge knows how the word enact is used in legal contexts better than your person who is still learning about the law, right? And similarly goes kind of one step deeper, and he's like, additionally, the basis for his definition is just, you know, one random Merriam-Webster dictionary definition, which kind of further underscores the point that despite the language making it sound that this person is kind of comprehensively surveying the legal literature and, you know, has a clear intent to define and include and stuff, the quality of the card is just not as high in terms of kind of being able to speak authoritatively to this issue as the negs. And this CX, I think, is incredibly effective in establishing that.
And it's just the elections to add. Let me know when everyone's good. Trump re-election is existential. First, it locks in global warming, ensures climate goals can never be met. That causes irreversible tipping points, which risk ecosystem collapse and catastrophic sea rise that jeopardize the human species. Second, it causes nuclear prolif. Enhanced America First policies triggers allied nuclear acquisition that risks nuclear accidents and miscalculation. Trump re-election turns sentencing and inequality. Call and 20. He promised to overturn Roe, gave a green light for employers to deny insurance, reversed a rule requiring governments to avoid housing that have a disparate impact. But damage can be cut short if he is defeated. If Trump manages to win, Roe could be overturned. Affirmative action ended. Progress ground to a halt. The court will be pro-business, anti-labor, and anti-consumer. Defendants would do even worse. Civil rights will remain more abound. Trump will implement aggressive measures against immigrants. If this solves the case, Biden will do the affirmative. That's Astor and 20. Dems are unified in seeking a major overhaul of the criminal justice system. They argued for aggressive new policies. Candidates focused heavily on changes to sentencing. A top priority would be to reduce incarceration. Biden said a bill would be his first proposal. They say betting markets. Their evidence is dated. Those markets have flipped. That's Higgins and 6-2. Biden has surged past Trump in online betting markets, tied to 2020. Biden's chances have risen to 50% and 53%. Change of a race comes as Biden positions himself as Trump's opposite. A dramatic example came on Monday when police forcefully ousted peaceful protesters. Biden's stance during the crisis has boosted his standing. Preferences aren't locked in. There's still a significant portion of undecided voters if a plan could sway. That's the lemon evidence. Biden is ahead with swing voters, latter in 522. A new survey found solid support for Biden among African-American women. Biden appears to be doing fairly well among swing voters. 9% of Trump's 2016 voters plan to switch to Biden. He's in good shape now, but it'll be close. Collins and 20. Biden has led Trump in every national poll. His advantage in these polls varies and has rarely been decisive. Real Clear Politics average shows Biden ahead of Trump. Biden is in good shape, but race is very close in states Biden may need to win. They say COVID. That won't impact elections. That's Siders and 20. Conventional wisdom has been that Trump's handling of his crisis is deeply problematic. It may not be that simple. Trump has time that he can mold the narrative to his benefit. Mishandling doesn't mean voters will penalize Trump. CJR is the main focus, especially after George Floyd. That's Politico and 423. Criminal justice is finally having a moment in U.S. politics. 2020 is different. Dem candidates, including Biden, devoted significant space on their platforms for ideas for fixing the criminal justice system. Economy is also irrelevant. That's Shepard and 18. Trump has defied conventional wisdom. Recession seems like an overreaction to pin his future. There's limited evidence a recession would doom Trump. As the economy continued to grow, Trump's approval rating has remained in the low 40s. They say no link. The ticky-tacky court stuff is irrelevant. The plan literally has Kavanaugh and Gorsuch affirmative action the entire economy. That's an unprecedented move that will undoubtedly be on the minds of voters come fall. Trump is tied to the courts. He's appointed 2 justices and will take credit for their rulings. He's a spin master. COVID-19. Trump's penchant for overselling accomplishments has been a vivid display. Trump has been a master of the art of exaggeration. People want to believe that something is the most spectacular. It's a very effective form of promotion, and that works even if media corrections amplify his achievements. That's Dale and 19. Incessant exaggeration does seem to be an effective form of promotion. Trump knows false figures will be broadcast to voters. The act of correcting him means the media has to amplify the accomplishment. The courts themselves are also inherently political. Saving SCOTUS has been driving liberal turnout. The plan decreases voter outrage, which lowers turnout. Also, the court mandates that Congress and the executive get involved because they have to craft policies that comply to the mandate of a ruling, which means that Trump can still take credit for the follow-on. The link threshold is low. That's Chalfant and 20. Trump is trying to sway a key portion of the electorate. A strategy that peels away even a few percentage points can have a meaningful impact. If Trump increases vote total by 2 or 3 percentage points, it can make the election harder. Anything that tamps down support is dangerous for Democrats. Millions of voters stayed home when Trump defeated Clinton. Trump will face questions about his sincerity. A strategy focused on criminal justice reform could help Trump expand on the portion achievements Trump rhetoric. They say no internal link. The Chung card. Chung isn't just about Ohio. It ties the importance of CJR to national electoral trends. But Ohio is a swing state, which means polling is applicable to other vital regions. Literally only 2 presidents in the last century have won the election without winning Ohio. CJR is a huge deal, but even secondary issues can sway 2020. Because it'll be close. That's Tanner. And 19, criminal justice has become a hot topic on the campaign trail. There's also a large degree of politics behind criminal justice reform. Biden is perceived as vulnerable on the issue. Trump has taken the opportunity to tweak Biden. The First Step Act symbolically highlighted a changing politics. With a general election looking extremely close, even secondary issues could play an outsized role in deciding the election. Keep your eyes on criminal justice reform. They say no brink, just an assertion. Star makes a distinction. But second term triggers all the impacts. Uniqueness, brinks are just uniqueness for us for the first term. They say no impact to second term, irrelevant to both our internals. First, alliances has nothing to do with political power and everything to do with perception. Trump's second term cements America first and allied uncertainty. Congress obviously can't intervene because it's faux post. Second is Paris. Trump is already committed to withdrawing, and no evidence says he can do it unilaterally. In fact, our evidence says that Democratic candidate would be likely to not withdraw from Paris, which means that stalls because vacancy to Paris alone is sufficient to avoid catastrophic warming.
So this what in R, I think, has a bunch of very clear and efficient explanations, which is great. I think the link work is especially notable. In particular, Zidao here kind of aggressively recharacterizes the plan and connects that to kind of all their link and internal link evidence in kind of an in-depth warranted way. Doesn't just throw out author names or whatever. Instead of what he could have done instead, which is just start reading some cards about the court linking. He did read a ton of EV, like you need to on a DA, as you need to on a DA like this. But that kind of spin, or in my view, kind of like storytelling and proactive application of the evidence is really notable, i.e. this is not some minor court tinkering. This is the justices that Trump has put in place and run on, and is calling attention to going into 2020 as well. Totally upending all of their existing approach to things and doing sweeping across the board affirmative action on every issue. That is massive, unprecedented, and that's pretty compelling. Similarly, answers this argument about their evidence just talking about Ohio, but being like, number one, no, and explaining why that's not the case. But two, crucially, being like, even if that's true, here's why we still win, right? So in this case, even if it only is about Ohio or only affects Ohio, here is why Ohio is keeping the election. That's the sort of like layered even if type framing that you want to be doing. Similarly, has this line toward the bottom that I think is quite effective, or that really a couple of places with the impact stuff. It's like, it has nothing to do with political power, everything to do with perception, right? So is kind of very explicitly taking into account not just their claim, but their warrant. It's like, here's why their warrant does not take out our warrant. Additionally, he says at the very bottom, he's like, they conceded that Paris alone is sufficient to avoid catastrophic warming. Now, that sort of idea, or that sort of argument, I think is very important and underutilized for both sides, but one place where that's especially useful is in the 1NR, often kind of even at the very top, right? If there are specific things, not just that the 2AC did say, but the 2AC did not say, that mean that there is something the judge knows is true, that can have dramatic implications for how you assess and relate to the risk of a given issue, right? So for example, if I know for sure that warming will be solved right now, then, and that it's, probably existential, or at minimum would hurt a bunch of people, that is a very different frame from if I only know or am reminded that like warming is bad and a pretty big deal, right? So if the 2AC is just like, here's what impact defense warming, that 1NR should not start off with like, yes, impact warming, you're wrong about that. It should instead be, they have conceded that warming will totally be fixed now, and that if we do the plan, it will not be. So you know for sure that warming is either fixed or not fixed. Now, let's talk about how bad warming is, right? And so like for a decision maker, that matters much.
What was I gonna do? Oh yeah, okay, I'm good. Current algorithmic risk assessments perpetuate racist sentencing practices in our criminal justice system. You have a moral imperative to reject racism. It's an ongoing condition that justifies horrific violence against Black people, minority communities. Only the plan is able to effectively undo the racial biases in sentencing. No gap. We reduce disparate sentencing, which directly impacts mass incarceration, irrelevant because we think we should prevent racism at any instance we can, and we access util through our econ advantage. So the extinction claims are irrelevant. An argument isn't prioritizing some lives over other. We're just saying that we should be able to directly solve for racism when we can, especially for unlikely scenarios they presenting are complicit in anti-Black racism. The proxy discrimination advantage, economic decline causes the next World War III among great powers, terrorism, massive inequality, turns the impact of the DISAD, can't solve climate change in the world of no economy. And also we have an internal link to war as well. And yes, spillover, their evidence is about distinguishing the status quo, which the plan would clarify. Yes, precedent is there. The plan enshrines that legal clarity by ruling on the Equal Protection Clause, which means that other laws consisting of racial biases and algorithms we held unconstitutional. That means the econ scenario is a solvency deficit counter plan, but not the plan. No legal distinction of any algorithm violates an Equal Protection Clause. Obviously, they would fall under the same grounds. Political reasons don't matter because liberal judges would check just as likely have any evidence on this, and companies don't have to make their own AI. They just use existing algorithms. The only difference is that it defers in inputs. Companies want to comply to avoid suits, which means enforcement would be immediate. Also, fiat means the plan would enforce immediately. And COVID doesn't kill the economy, proven by the status quo, but this takes out their impact if they win, we're terminally screwed. Their lieu evidence is about long-term trends, which the plan would solve with a minority business boom, and inequality is key. It accounts for 40% of the GDP. Also, it's an independent impact. They dropped results in extinction because white supremacist AIs will rule out everyone they view deviant. T. Predictability outweighs and turns their offense. Our evidence is clear to define and exclude theirs doesn't, which completely eviscerates AFF ground because it takes out half the topic, destroys neg is a less predictable topic, means the neg loses out on debating the core of the education, even if it's a different agent. Key cases in CRD would be completely overlooked, i.e. cases in Equal Protection Clause, Carpenter, Miranda, reducing sentences. All of things are very valuable to talk about and provide the only portable skills in debate, which is advocacy. We meet the right evidence indicates that enactment of law would include the courts, and legal precedent does not exclude enactment. Prefer evidence is the consensus of several court decision and legal dictionaries. Their Berman evidence is only talking about particular reading of a bill and is prescriptive, not descriptive. And yes, qualifications, it's citing a Denver Supreme Court decision and Black's Law in conjunction with Merriam-Webster. They haven't made an argument as to why a judge's decision should be given heavier legal weight. Yes, no legal precision. That's just, their evidence is just a founder's definition of enactment. Obviously, legal interpretations evolve, and it isn't a good litmus test for current definitions. No offense on net ground. Predictability turns in. The only disad they lose at best is elections, but that's vastly outweighed by the links they gain to actually winnable courts disads, which multiplies the negative arsenal. They say res context. Their res context evidence says nothing, so you should make me answer it. They're reading the right evidence wrong. It gives examples of what the court can enact, and no increase. We only decrease the pain of black people. And their evidence is not about the AFF, the counterplan. Counterplan solves zero of the AFF, no sufficiency framing to reject any instance of racism. That was the case page. And no follow-on. States have zero reason to comply to the plan. Crossify the 1AC Johnson evidence. They act in their best legal interest. If the federal government refuses to clarify legal precedents and states retract their participation at any point and even go against federal law, that's Gardner. Only the Fed can condition funding to coerce compliance. And the federal government will still prosecute offenses that are legal under state law. That's here. And 4, the federal government advances policy by directly enforcing through its agents. Federal enforcement resources have been growing rapidly. The federal government has enacted target that's permissible under state law. The objective of preventing states from implementing policies that contravene federal preferences. When a state does criminalize conduct is prohibited under federal law by imposing more lenient penalties. Federal agents overcome the lenience by prosecuting drug offenders in federal court. You can mark it at federal court, and uniformity is in every state. Varying interpretations of law, which means it won't be complete. That's Barco. It's not a theory argument, which the 2NC assumes. The counterplan doesn't fiat uniformity, so they didn't get in the 2NC because they didn't change the counterplan text, which is their fault. Our card isn't about fringe cases. Empirical examples prove that states won't comply absent clarified precedent, i.e. desegregation. Their 2NC evidence is aspirational. Vest just says the federal government can fall on, not that it would have the will to, nor that states would comply to it, and they've messed up on permutation. Do both. Extended here, criminal justice reform is of overlapping jurisdiction. Their own Baycroft evidence concedes that there have been past encroachments to prove simultaneous actions possible and inevitable. That's Ashdown. The Barco evidence they read concedes that the Fed should step in when the states are inconsistent, like consistent, and shield the links to elections because it appears like the states are taking authority and the federal government is taking the back wheel. Also shields a link because we go through the courts. It'll be on the disad. Shields a link to federalism because our Ashton evidence says it's overlapping, and I don't have to win the 3 benches stuff because they are not definite. Those are conditional, not perceptual. Federalism. Extend a link their evidence about CRJ federalism. There's no reason as to why we uniquely link to that. Also, no spillover. This 2NC spin is insufficient. They need to read evidence saying that the plan would cause all the negative impacts of federal we're talking about. Also, we access the impact, so I'm not going to read anything else. DA, elections. This disad is ridiculous, and the AFF outweighs mass inequality, gun decline, all clean and extinction, which is not a word that doesn't come out of the one in ours mouth. No turns case. Their whole evidence is doesn't assume the plan, which checks any egregious abuses by Trump, and Biden doesn't solve their evidence about a bill and not the AFF. And CRG is not key to the 2020 healthcare, education, economy outweigh. Even if CRG is part of the narrative, isn't a reason why voters would decide purely on that basis. That's Haranovsky and 20. At least 30% adults rate being extremely important to the 2020 national security, gun policy, education, and the economy. The fluctuation in import may reflect the president's party set education, the policy their incumbent candidate is pushing on actually implement. No link. The plan goes through the courts. Their evidence about Trump trying himself to win for conservatives, which obviously isn't the same thing. And all their evidence about Trump spinning the plan would mean that he obviously wouldn't tie himself to it, which is proven past court decisions.
All right, so this 1AR I think is really solid. Does a good job of not being inefficient. So for example, in the case, when Kathy could instead have been like, they say X, we say Y, that would, that takes more time than you have in the 1AR. Instead, there's a lot of embedded clash, while still kind of signposting very clearly. There's also a bunch of good kind of evidence comparison going on. There were also a bunch of like deliberate and effective choices being made in terms of which kind of offense is important, which things to extend. One change that probably could or should have been made was could have cut down on topicality a little bit, not necessarily even in terms of the arguments being extended, but certainly kind of made them a little bit more efficiently or kind of picked them and impacted them out a little bit better, which would have freed up some additional time for elections. But the single biggest issue here is a substantive one, those kind of previewed earlier, and that is that there's not an argument made about why about like preemption of the states, right? So like the states doing this would be unconstitutional. That is very much a thing that the AFF needs in this debate, and got to find a way to smuggle that in.
The election page, then the states/FISM page. then the sentencing page, then the proxy discrimination page. You good? Okay. We win the debate even if we win 0 of the counterclaim because the dissent is dramatically bigger than the case and turns it. They dropped that Trump re-election would destroy global alliances, which causes global nuclear proliferation, radioactive pollution against the most vulnerable, and miscalculated nuclear war, which they dropped would wipe out black people first through nuclear targeting. They also conceded that it causes global warming, which will cook the planet alive and cause massive environmental injustice globally. It also turns and solves the case because Trump is way worse for mass incarceration since he pursues a politics of racist fear-mongering that criminalizes the most vulnerable in American society. And they drop that Biden will do huge criminal justice reform and increase economic equality. Even if they're right, and that doesn't literally do the AFF, that is still a massive blow to racist incarceration. It actually arguably solves better because we're running a huge risk of case defense about why courts are ineffective at fixing this issue because of their uniquely ineffective mechanism of enforcement relative to Congress, which is how our evidence says that Biden would effectuate criminal justice reform. Go to the line by line. First, they say that criminal justice reform is not key to the election. It is key to the election. Extend our Huggins evidence, which is from the beginning of June, which is by far the most recent piece of evidence. It says that betting markets have swung to Biden because he has an edge on criminal justice reform. Healthcare and the economy are not an issue because they're slowly evolving issues that all of the relevant political actors will spin into irrelevance, which is the one in our Siders evidence. CJR is also the main focus because George Floyd has elevated the conversation, which is the Politico evidence, which also postdates all of their other thumper cards. It's more important than the economy specifically, which is proven by political science, which is the Shepard evidence. They didn't extend their 2AC card by name, so you should not evaluate it, but that card is from April and from a random Berkeley undergraduate, so you should not care about it relative to the overwhelming weight of our evidence. Their 1AR card says that people self-report the economy and other issues as important, which does not answer our warrants about why those issues are spun to oblivion, and it also doesn't prove that any of those issues are more important than CJR. That card's also older than our evidence, so it doesn't assume the swelling of the protests. They say that the plan is the courts which shield. Courts don't shield. The 1NC link proves the plan has a massive impact on the national conversation. Trump will take credit for any win because it fits the historical narrative. Even if it doesn't make sense, he'll sell that narrative to voters. He's a spin master and the media supports him, so this deception will work. That's the two pieces of 1NR evidence. They dropped the turnout analytic that says even if Trump doesn't take credit, the plan makes the court look liberal, which decreases the urgency behind liberal turnout, which makes Dems lose across the board. And they dropped that courts would mandate that Congress gets involved, which also links, and they dropped the margins are tiny, so any link would tip the scales. Go to the state's counterplan. It solves the case. We're kicking federalism. We'll concede there's no link and it's not key. There is follow-on. Even if there isn't follow-on, it still solves massively because the vast majority of criminal justice stuff occurs at the state level, which are those cards about the state's all cause on the case. But there is follow-on. Their card says that there are exceptions from the rule that says that the federal government generally imitates the states, but they dropped warrants about how the states are labs of innovation. They set an example that can be used by federal advocates to make more effective arguments, and their O'Hear card just says the feds could still prosecute offenses, doesn't answer our political argument that says that they would not be willing to do so because we changed the nature of the conversation. The counterplan does use uniform fiat, which was the 2NC clarification. They dropped that's good because it enables better testing of federal government key warrants. States will comply because of fiat. Their desegregation empiric is a neg arg because it proves that states won't comply with federal orders unless it's fiated. The permutation solves federalism, but it still links to elections because Trump will seize on federal involvement to spin himself positively. At worst, if the perm shields and the counterplan fails, you should kick the counterplan for me and just evaluate the case. The sentencing page. Extend 1NC number 1, the state's alt cause. The reach of the plan is massively limited compared to the reach of the counterplan because the vast majority of the criminal justice system is at the state level. Feds are only 13%, which was the warrant from the card in the 1NC, and the gap is 2 million people. The 1AR did not clarify that they increase any preemption, which means that none of those things are solved by the affirmative. Extend 1NC number 2, utilitarianism. We're not going to go for strict util that says any nuke war always outweighs racism or anything, but they dropped a bunch of arguments about why extinction, even if more lives outweighs, because it's key to preserve future generations, which are infinite in value. And they dropped that nuclear war is incredibly anti-black because it targets cities. That's a massively greater scope and greater intensity than the plan, which is lower intensity over a longer period of time. Go to the proxy discrimination advantage. I'm only going to go for this no spillover argument. The court is conservative and is not going to choose to apply the plan's precedent. They assume that the plan's fiated precedent necessarily would be applied across the board, but courts have discretion about the way that they can do that, and they will choose to constrain the plan's precedent to its facts. A litany of court cases empirically prove this is true for sentencing, which is the Olson evidence. Liberal judges don't check spillover because the court's conservative, so the political calculus would dominate against spillover. They say that enforcement would be quick because companies will use existing algorithms. What algorithms? The whole point of the plan is that existing algorithms are racist and that the courts need to compel them to be better. That process is slow, the development process is insanely long, and the courts cannot force it to happen in time.
Another day, another excellent speech from Truth. So this, few noteworthy things about this 2NR. The first is, notice what Truth does here, as I've kind of previewed extensively now, in terms of exploiting the app's missteps with respect to states and the inability to force good algorithms, right? So I said early on that those threads from CX to the 1AC would end up mattering, and here they are. Another thing that is particularly important is the ways that Truth kind of goes through and compares and synthesizes the warrants of each side, right? So it compares arguments and evidence and resolves them for the judge. This is partly a question of kind of the even if type stuff I talked about earlier, but more fundamentally, it's an issue of not just kind of getting caught up in your own arguments, but instead understanding that what you need to do is compare in comparative terms, win the debate, provide the judge with a set of ways of deciding these individual kind of mini debates in your favor, right? You need to establish not just what your argument is about the thing, but why you are more right than they are about the set of claims. So a few kind of like specific cherry-picked examples. When he's doing a lot of the comparison about kind of uniqueness and link stuff, he's like, they read this, they make the set of link defense arguments, but it doesn't answer the distinction we had in the block and like this card we had that's comparatively more important than political science, blah, blah, blah. Similarly, kind of digs deeper into that and is like, the card they read about this, they don't, cite it by name, they don't extend it in a very warranted way, so they don't do that work for them. But additionally, here are some issues with it. It says that voters self-report issues like the economy is important. But even if they self-report those issues, it doesn't prove that it's more important than criminal justice reform, nor answer the arguments and evidence we've been reading that criminal justice reform in particular will get spun, especially at this moment in time, in a way that will flip the election, whereas the economy will successfully get spun to not negatively affect Trump, right? And the roots of a lot of those arguments are way back in CX of the 1C, where Zidao paints Trump as somebody who will benefit from a positive thing, but is kind of Teflon and doesn't have a bunch of negative stuff get stuck to him. Plus, kind of the embedded uniqueness component of like, he's not doing so hot right now, but he needs a win. And all of the kind of work done both in the 1C and in the block to distinguish the link and the scale of the set of criminal justice reform stuff and the constituencies for whom that matters from some of these other potential thumpers. Truth then also says it's also older than our evidence, so it doesn't assume the size of the terrains. Now, most, a huge chunk of the speeches that I see, they stop at it's older than our cards, or maybe go a step further and it's like it's older than our evidence, so it doesn't, assume recent developments. Truth doesn't do that. He explains what it is about the difference in date that matters for the issue, right? The size of the protests. Another quick example of this, when talking about follow-on stuff, Truth, it deals with some of the kind of the top line arguments, but then it's like their evidence also just says that they could still prosecute offenses, doesn't answer our argument that they would not do so because, right? And so the fact that the AF read this card that was like, it's possible, Neg is proactively digging into that, pointing that out, and making a set of pointing out that their argument gets at not whether or not it's possible, but whether or not it would in fact occur. Those are kind of a couple of quick minor examples, but the point is, I definitely would recommend watching that 2NR multiple times and flowing it and thinking about it and paying attention to what's going on there, because that's a great model. 2AR.
Setting a legal precedent through the EPC is key in order to challenge racial bias in the criminal justice system. Currently, algorithms that check for risk assessment bias are not shifting the disproportionate effect on Black individuals in the CJR. The plan is necessary to check back against abusive judges of criminal laws that effectively make it easier to incarcerate Black people. The app sets a precedent that will affect all CJR laws. It's then akin in lieu evidence that talks about how racial disparities stagnate growth because minorities are prevented from fully accessing the market and creating business, which leads to extinction. This leads to a litany of impacts such as social and societal economic collapse that will lead to a nuclear war and extinction. The lack of work done on the Terns case analysis by Kathy is going to win us the round. In a world where economic decline happens, we can invest our best efforts towards solving for warming crisis, which will doom us all. This means that it doesn't matter if Biden wins in November because he won't have resources to reverse the damage and Trump has already done. Also, even if you don't buy this, they aren't winning the debate that prioritizing solving for racism has to come first. That's our maybe evidence. Theoretical assumptions shouldn't be way over discrimination in the status quo. It means you prioritize the apple for anything else. On the lava line debate, they say that states all causes, but first off, we reduce disparity sentencing. The federal department is key, and it's not limited because fiat means the plan is immediate and states will comply. And second, on the permanent vote debate, which we'll get to later, will resolve all causes. On the YouTube debate, we've already covered this above, but one, we access their framing through the economic decline, which will lead to a nuclear war and ultimately extinction. They make an argument of talking about that nuclear war is anti-Black. If we agree with this analysis, this is not a reason why it takes off the app, or probably a reason why you should instead uniquely prefer the app over the negatives counter plan. On the proxy arguments, they say you can group the two of spillover, and they say courts won't create a precedent. Yes, spillover, because the federal government is key to set the precedent for future cases, and it makes the state courts have to comply because it resolves the equal protection clause that makes it to where they can't have a challenge to risk assessment bias in algorithms currently in the status quo. They also make an argument, they say, what algorithms, but they concede the Thomas and Johnson evidence through the entire debate, which says that improves the plan will ensure that new algorithms that will be implemented will counter and not replicate the certain disparities that are already in the status quo. We only have to win the permutation do both debate, which they clearly mishandled, but we'll get to that now. On the states. First off, they concede on the counterplan debate, the DISAD, they concede that the counterplan links to the DISAD analysis. First, that Congress is a political institution, and they concede that there's a plan flaw specifically with the counterplan because it just says the states and the sub-federal entities, but doesn't say specifically that state courts will implement the plan or try to resolve the equal protection clause. Also proves that they don't have the precedent to be able to do so, which means that you should probably prioritize the permanent vote debate. The first two arguments they make, they say is that there will follow on, there's follow on for state alone is key, and they say that state labs are key to innovation. And first off, this proves that there's no solvency and there's no warrant that actually says why it will solve, but even still, the argument why it's an innovation test bed proves that there will not be a guaranteed world of compliance, which means that you probably should default to the world where the federal government is included. Also, they make an argument that say that 50 states could and they will comply. Extend our O'Hear evidence that they didn't touch on, and it specifically talks about in the context of criminal court cases where states alone can't resolve the inevitable federal overreach, which means that we have to start there. Also, on the permanent vote debate, they say the perm leads to election, and it gives Trump credit. First off, it proves the perm do both is the best way to solve because one, it ensures federal reform while not sacrificing state authority. Also, the perm doesn't link to the disadvantage because the federal courts are the drivers for the reform, and then it will trickle down to the states. Even if they prove that we link this, means that the counterplan doesn't have offense because they have conceded the federalism debate that they had offense on, and they haven't done a good job of arguing specifically why the state courts will be shielded or why Trump wouldn't be able to take credits from the state courts either. On the disadvantage. We're going to win this on the Terns case analysis that was done in the top case outweighs in Terns. Specifically, in a world of economic decline, Trump or Biden wouldn't be able to push any type of financial initiative to be able to challenge the global warming that is happening in the status quo. Also, the second term will not matter because it does it will just continue racial disparities that's already happening now and prove that growth is being hampered. Also, they can see the COVID arguments about how it will supercharge our impact because the effect of COVID on the economy and the style of stagnated growth means that it will only be further exacerbated in a world where we don't do the plan. They also make an argument. They say that when they try to do analysis for the impact of the outweighs arguments, we already covered this. Clearly, extinction is only true in the context of the app, but not true in the context of the this app because one, it should have already happened in the world where Trump was president in the first term, and he already eliminated the Paris Treaty or at least our connection to it, as well as a continuation of destabilizing alliances, which means that there's no world that we can return besides actually doing the plan. They say Biden will do reform, but already said that there's no funding. They say courts are ineffective, but the courts are effective because it sets a legal precedent to comply. You can group their next two arguments where they say CJR is key to the election, but uniqueness takes out the link because the George Floyd already happening in the polls are still close in their uniqueness evidence, which means that specifically it proves that criminal justice reform isn't true. But in the world where our lebanon evidence actually talks about COVID being outweighing, it hampers the economy and healthcare issues will be cited in our evidence, which proves that those are more pertinent issues outside of just COVID reform. probably a reason why we're going to win, because they don't really have a clear link to that.
This is a great 2AR here by Darcell. There are a number of things that are kind of really good about it and notable, but one in particular that I want to flag is I think a lot of this kind of turns case and impact comparison work for the first minute or so of the 2AR is really, really good. Several ways in which that's true. So first of all, it's kind of very deep and warranted and direct and comparative, right? So kind of like I talked about earlier during the block, one thing that Darcell does excellently here is kind of fully unpacking both at the internal link and the impact level why they, how their arguments interact with the other sides, how they compare to the other sides, why they're comparatively more right about this being net good as opposed to bad. Instead of just being like, are things, high magnitude, whatever. So for example, this explanation of how an economic shock means that it doesn't matter who wins in November because we won't have the resources and ability to kind of invest in resolving warming. He also kind of points out quite correctly that a lot of this is grounded in work that 1AR did explicitly, and that the 2NR kind of doesn't necessarily do a bunch of work to respond to. I think that there's also a bunch of, the strategic vision here is quite clear, right? Darcell definitely understands what sets of arguments on each sheet of paper he needs to extend and spend time on in order to win this debate, which is, very much kind of where you want to be. One other thing that I think is worth noting here is, well, actually, I guess before I say that, in light of the issue that, I've already kind of talked about, that in terms of kind of prior AF missteps or whatever, you're going to be in a bunch of debates, almost every debate that you ever have, really, where some set of things didn't go the way that you wanted them to. And so the question then becomes, what is your route to victory? And Darcell clearly is thinking about this, right? And that's part of why there's this emphasis on the set of impact stuff that connects to the one solvency deficit they plausibly do have that they can get some mileage out of, namely this, it linked in large part to this plan flaw thing, right? So Darcell spends a good amount of time on this argument that the counterplan text only explicitly mandates that the states and subfederal governments are going to do the plan, not that the courts are going to rule, that the state courts are going to rule and change equal protection jurisprudence, nor does the NEG read a piece of evidence that they're able to do so. The implication of which is that they don't solve this broader kind of precedent stuff, right? Which also gets at why there is so much more of a focus on that at the top of the 2AR as opposed to a lot of this other kind of like sentencing racism stuff, which is there, but only briefly toward the end, and is discussed in terms of taking a stand against racism being bad, which connects to a lot of this kind of broader inequality stuff, not just kind of the sentencing internal link that it's framed as part of the 1AC, right? So in other words, Darcell clearly understands what their solvency deficit needs to be, and the whole 2AR is then built around winning that outweighs the neg's offense. He also is explicitly packaging that as in terms of the permutation, and a big part of that is because the 2AR is this big push on there's so much more stuff at criminal justice stuff at the state level, and it's like, okay, fine, perm obviously solves that stuff. There also is at least some chance that it kind of shields the link to these DAs. So the real question then is like, does the link to the perm outweigh this other solvency deficit about precedent or not? Now, that being said, I do think that one additional kind of step further that would be worth taking in this 2AR is explicitly from the get-go kind of framing it, doing a little bit more to write the judge's ballot for me, right? So explicitly framing it in those terms that I laid out just now, being like, look, here's what the solvency deficit has to be. Here's why. Perm solves all this other business. So the core question that you have to answer in this debate is whether the link to the permutation, the elections linked to the perm, outweighs this like precedent spillover stuff or not. Say just a couple sentences to lay that out, and then spend a chunk of time winning that the precedent spillover impact is really big, which again, Darcell does spend a bunch of time on at the top, but explicitly framing it in those terms is really useful for ensuring that when the debate ends and the dust clears and the judge is kind of going through, reading back through the flow and lining things up, that they are thinking about those things in the terms that you want them to. So it leads them to the conclusion you want it to lead them to, as opposed to just being, one more piece of the puzzle that they kind of take in and do with whatever they want. But yeah, so on the whole, really excellent debate from both sides. Hope that you all enjoyed it and learned something, and would encourage you to come back and watch it again at some point in the future and kind of get as much out of it as possible. One of the benefits of all this being online is that the demo debate does not end or does not have to when you leave camp. Hope you'll have had a great experience this summer if you joined us, and also hope that you come back next year.